Wheatley, final mix.
This is a living portrait of Dennis Wheatley, taken in 1967 at his home, Grove Place, Lymington, Hampshire. His writings have been translated into 27 languages, so he's become famous throughout the world. But his first book was not published until 1933, so authorship has been one of his occupations for only the second half of his life. He is a man of tremendous energy and many interests. He was a wine merchant to King's, has worn the uniform of all three services, and during the Second World War was one of Sir Winston Churchill's staff officers. He will now tell you his best story, that of his own life.
Well, here we are. This is where I work, and it takes me about 7 months to write a book. But that means working long hours. I work about 9.5 hours a day on average for 6 days a week. But on the other hand, of course, for the other 5 months, I'm able to get away quite a bit, getting new backgrounds for books and so on. But there's always proof correcting and all sorts of odd jobs, television and so on going on. I always write in pencil because I found it the easiest way in the long run, because one can rub out and correct as one goes. But if I typed, it would be quite terrible because my spelling's appalling and it hit me in the eye. And my grammar, if anything, is even worse. I could tell you an adjective and an adverb if you paid me. But I can tell a story. Yes, I can tell a story. 58 of them, including a biography of Charles II and a history of the Russian Revolution. But let's go back to the beginning. I may look a sweetie pie, but I am told that I was incredibly pig-headed. If I didn't want to do anything, I used to lie flat on my back and kick. This is the house in which I entered this wicked world. It doesn't look as though I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, does it? But it was a jolly good silver-plated one. Here are some pictures of my grandfather's house. He was an ironmaster, and his home was in Aladdin's cave of treasure. So when I was still a child, we moved to a much larger home. My father put in electric light. Not many houses had it then, and motor cars were a rare sight. Most of the houses like ours had an acre of garden and servants living in. At the age of 8, I was sent to boarding school at Margate. My other grandfather lived at Westgate, and I used to be allowed to go there for 2 weekends every term. In 1908, I was sent to Dulwich as a day boy, and I detested that place. No pillow fights at night, no real chums, and those loathsome compulsory games. By that time, I discovered Dumas, and reading was my fun. In the third term, I ran away. And from the papers in my desk, it was discovered that I'd been running a secret society. And so I was expelled. That was one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life, because my father decided I needed discipline, and I was sent as a cadet to HMS Worcester. Now, life on the Worcester was pretty grim. Rowing boats in winter weather ashore, scrubbing decks with bursting tube lanes, hanging on to rigging 80 feet above the deck. It was a hard life, but it was wonderful training for young people, because it taught them how to stand up to hardships in later life. When I was 16, my father sent me to Germany to learn about winemaking, and I spent the best part of a year in a little village called Traben-Trauber on the Moselle. From 6 o'clock in the morning, I was a sailorman, for the afternoons were my own for boating, swimming, playing tennis. And very often with chaps my own age, I used to sit up until the small hours of the morning, singing, drinking, and having a jolly good time. I returned home for Christmas 1913, and then I went into my father's business for 6 months. Everything was fixed up for me to go to Reims in August 1914. Well, I had my French share, but it wasn't learning to make champagne. I was given my first commission in September 1914 in the 2nd City of London Royal Field Artillery. But the war was pretty grim. There was a man in Marlborough's day who described war as long periods of intense boredom punctuated by short intervals of acute fear, and that goes for war in any age. The thing that got me down worst was spending 3 or 4 hours every day for over 1,000 days watching my men water, feed and groom horses. And I've never really cared much for horses. I much prefer girls. Luckily, I wasn't killed or wounded, although I was also in the 3rd Battle of Ypres, and here's a map showing the mud of Passchendaele still on it that I used there. I was also at the Battle of Cambrai and the Battle of St. Quentin. In May 1918, I was gassed, invalided home, and I honestly don't know if I was ever gazetted out. I wangled leave from a depot 3 days after the armistice, and I just never went back. I went into my father's business again in January 1919. And then, in 1922, I married. Nancy was the very essence of gaiety, and we were tremendously happy. And 18 months later, she gave me a son, Anthony, and now he's got 6 children. In 1926, my father died, so I became the sole owner of the business. I doubled my turnover in a few years, but the business was undercapitalized, so I got caught up in the 1930 slump. I had to sell out to Combine. The year before I decided to do that was the most difficult and harassing of my whole life. And so in the hope of making 50 quid, I wrote a book, my first book, and here it is. It had a wonderful press. Norman Collins reviewed it the first day it was out. It sold 7 editions in 7 weeks. This was the first of 10 books about the Duc de Richelieu and his 3 friends, Simon Arden, Rex Van Ryn and Richard Eaton. They have become known as those modern musketeers, and of course their characters were inspired by those of Alexandre Dumas. And from that time, I never looked back. I transferred my wine collection to just reading books, but I never lost interest in good wine. This is my cellar, 3,000 bottles, and never was money better spent. The finest hocks are my great love. There are Chateauneuf Gems, magnificent Burgundies, Waterloo Sherry 1815, Imperial Tokai, original Chartreuse and genuine Napoleon brandies. While I was still doing well as a wine merchant, Nancy and I parted, but we remained good friends. And then, in the very darkest days of my life, Joan had the great courage to marry me. She's been an enormous help to me with my work and also my career. And in addition, she brought me a new family. She brought me 3 stepsons who've been like younger brothers to me. My wife also brought me 2 charming stepdaughters. And here you see me giving the youngest one away. As an author, of course, I met lots of other authors. And in Queen's Gate and St. John's Wood, we entertained quite a lot. People like Aldous Huxley, Cronin, Franco, Michael Arlen, Howard Spring, lots of other lesser lights. And that's the reason that I've got this lovely collection of, supposed to be one of the best in Britain, of autographed first editions. But a good half of my 4,000 booklinger's house are history, ancient religions, and occultism. Of course, for the backgrounds of my black magic books, I've got most of my stuff from reading. But also in the 1930s, I managed to get introductions to the famous occultists of the day, people like Aleister Crowley. But I must tell you one thing, that I have never attended an occult ceremony in my life because I regard it as definitely dangerous to get mixed up in that sort of thing. Of course, for all these books of mine do require enormous research. Now look at that pile over there. Practically every day now I'm referring to those because I'm writing a new Roger Brooks story for the lives of Napoleon, Fouché, Talleyrand, Constantinople, Persia, Brazil, all in Napoleon's time. That is my collection of Napoleon and his marshals. Ney, Soult, Davout, Lannes, Bessardes, Messina and the rest. this is Roger Brooke himself, who was born here at Grove Place. And he was Mr. Pitt's most resourceful secret agent in Napoleonic times. About my modern spy, master spy, Gregory Sallis, I've written 7 books that cover every principal event in the war of Europe, in the Second World War, from the beginning to the end. For whodunits, I've never had any time. I only wrote those crime dossiers in the 1930s, my old friend Joe Liggs, because they were an entirely new form of crime fiction. There were physical clues and photographs of real people and that sort of thing. But the booksellers, of course, wouldn't look at them. And with a famous bookseller in Piccadilly who took only 6 copies. Queen Mary came in the morning of publication, he bought the lot. And in 6 months we sold 120,000 copies. I collect all sorts of things besides books. Silk Persian rugs, stamps. There are 40,000 of that lot. This is our breakfast room. As you see, I don't keep all my stamps in albums. I also collect Georgian furniture. That was made in Chippendale's London workshop. The chairs I had made when we moved down here after the war. The backs and seats are Joan's beautiful work. Incidentally, we have every possible form of burglar alarm. What is more, I keep a shotgun in my bedroom, and I wouldn't hesitate to use it. By the by, these are portraits of 2 of Joan's ancestors. This looks modern, doesn't it? But it was copied by Joan from a fresco in the Palace of Knossos in Crete, which was painted 3,200 years ago. This is my bedroom, and from the windows of it I have a delightful view of the rose garden that I designed for Joan. I've been paid the compliment this year of being elected as president of the New Forest Agricultural Show. Now here is another of my collections. It is watched over by the goddess Kuan Yin, the Queen of Heaven. Isn't she lovely? I collect coins too. Charles II, right up. Louis XV, right up. And that's a piece of 8. All these stars you see on the ceiling, I cut out and stuck on, lying on my back on 2 planks. On one occasion I rolled off, and I was darn lucky not to break my neck. All these paintings and most of the furniture in this room are from my grandfather's fabulous collection. I cut all these fish out of illustrated books and stuck them on myself, just as I did the stars on the ceiling of my bedroom. This is Joan's drawing room, and those are the lovely poems that she wrote. The fire screen, and 2 chairs like that. This is Grove Place as it was in the 1860s. This is a beautiful edition of the Tyndall Bible. It was produced by the Royal Society of Literature, of which I have the honour to be a fellow, and I'm also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Freemen of the City of London. I fully believe in survival after death, so I'm not the least afraid of death. But naturally I hope that my death will not be a painful one. I believe in reincarnation. To be judged on one life is so manifestly unfair, because so many people are born cripples or children of criminal parents. But in reincarnation, the happiness that you give to other people in this life is repaid to you by happiness in the next life. And to die is to meet all our old friends who've died before you. And so it's the greatest adventure of all. Joan gives me these little boxes as souvenirs of our travels. Of course, in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, we've been to many times. And also to Austria, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Holland, and all over the place. We've also been to Greece and Egypt in the good old days, when every guide called An English Traveller, My Lord. And then, more recently, we've had to travel much further afield to get backgrounds for my books. And it pays the government very well to allow me travelling expenses, because I earn many thousands of pounds of foreign currency for the British government. It never fails to surprise me on my travels to find that my books are read by people of every race and colour. Since we came here, I've laid 60,000 bricks. I even wrote a book about it called Saturdays with Bricks. I dedicated it with his permission to Churchill as our greatest amateur builder and the architect of victory. During the early months of the war, I was a group leader of air wardens.
Here we are in our gas masks, not very becoming, are they? And I was in MI5, and after Hitler's blitzkrieg smashed the French in 1940, one of our officers told me that they'd been asked to think of ideas to resist invasion. So I said, why not ask my husband? He's always full of ideas.
The result was I sat down and I worked all night. And I wrote 5,000 words on resistance invasion. The paper went to the Admiralty, the Air Ministry, and the War Office. And a week later, Sir Louis Gregg, who was PA to the Secretary of State for Air, rang me up, asked me to come to lunch with him, and a wing commander who afterwards became Air Marshal Sir Lawrence Darvell. And when we talked about it, Darvell said, now, I'd like you to go home and consider yourself a top planner of German High Command and write another paper showing us the other side of the picture as to how you would invade and conquer England. I didn't know it. So at that moment, our boys were being taken off from Dunkirk.
And during the next 48 hours, Dennis got through 250 cigarettes, 5 magnums of champagne, but he produced 20,000 words on paper for a 5-day operation.
And a week later, Darvell asked me to lunch. And he told me that he was a member of the Joint Planning Staff. And then to my amazement, that all 3 chiefs of staff had read my paper. After that, I was asked to write all sorts of other papers, and between June 1940 and December 1941, I wrote over 500,000 words for the Joint Planning Staff upon various subjects. And Louis Gregg had shown my first paper to His Majesty King George VI, and His Majesty was gracious enough to do me the honour to say that he was to receive copies of all my other papers. Later on, those 500,000 words that I'd written was reduced in order to bring out the gist of them in a book called Stranger Than Fiction.
All the time they'd been wanting to have Dennis down in the fortress basement on Churchill's planning staff. But there was no way to get anyone in who hadn't been through Staff College.
But at last the chance came in December 1941, because they decided to make a special section and do nothing else but deceive and mystify the enemy. And so I was brought in, the only civilian ever been commissioned directly as the Joint Planning Staff of the War Cabinet. They told me that I was going as a pilot officer. I said I didn't mind if I went in wearing a chef's hat. But they put me up a ring a month. And for the first 5 months, I was attached to Colonel the Right Honourable Oliver Stanley to the FOPS, which means the Future Operational Planning Section. Then, Lieutenant Colonel John Bevan was brought in, and he was a separate office down in the basement. And he and I together did the cover plan for going into North Africa, Operation Torch. But to implement it, we had to bring other officers in. Eventually we ended up as part of 6. And as a real team, we all worked together. Well, after our 100% success with the North African landings and deceiving the enemy, we did all these things like ruses like The Man Who Never Was, False Montgomery, and of course we made the plans for the cover plan for the landings in Normandy. And they again were extraordinarily successful. I want to introduce you to 2 of my best friends. This is Cecil Blatch, the president of the International Association of Lawyers, and the chairman of my company. How are things going, sir?
Well, Dennis, they couldn't be better. When your two films, The Devil Rides Out and Uncharted Seas, which are being produced by Hammers, are shown, I think that you'll have about 50 film companies after your 50-odd books.
Right.
No, as far as the company's concerned, the sky is now the limit.
Splendid. Now I want to introduce you to my other best friend, Robert Lusty, Vice Chairman of the BBC, and when I first went to Hutchinson's, he was the art director. Now he's head of the whole great Hutchinson Publishing Group. Bob, how do we go?
Well, you do very well, about 1 million copies a year.
And that, of course, doesn't take into account the translations. And when Bantam books are published in America, I think that your sales will be 2 million for 1968.
Well, that's fine, and I've worked it out. My accountants told me that I've sold somewhere near 25 million copies from the beginning. To illustrate that number, if one had a rope running from the Earth right up to the moon, you could hang a weekly book every 50 feet. Now, how are we going, Bob?
Well, fine, Dennis. You're one of the very few living authors published in a collector's edition, and here they are, all 50 of them. Every book you've ever written is in paperback. We keep a press at our printers at Tiptree, printing practically nothing else but Dennis Wheatley. We never have less than 1 million copies of yours in stock.
Thank you, Bob. How right I was never to change my publisher.
Dennis, but tell us, to what do you attribute this enormous success of yours?
Energy and enthusiasm.
And when do you intend to retire?
Well, I'm often asked that. The reply is never. I hope to write another 50 books.
Well, here's to it.
Thank you.